Good morning, this is Jen, the Liberty Lion. Today we have a video on the registration of businesses. I think it was earlier today, Judge Napolitano posted a short video about how the city of Houston is requiring certain places such as bars and clubs to post security cameras all around the outside of their businesses. And they are supposed to pay for it at their own expense. And this was decided by a council of people who voted 15-1 for this requirement. Judge Napolitano says this is called a taking. When it requires you to register your business, when it requires you to use your own money to comply with some sort of dictate. Okay, you can find that video on YouTube if you should choose to watch it. So keeping in mind this idea of taking, I was wondering then, is the requirement to register businesses when there actually is no requirement to register business, is this also a taking? So they require you, or they tell you that you're required to register a business, even when you're not required to register a business. And then people think they're required to do it, and so they do it. This costs money because you have to pay fees, and then you have to comply with rules and regulations to which you're not actually required to comply with. So is this a taking also? So where did this idea of requiring people to register their businesses come from? Again, I look at the officer's manual. There's a few of them available online. I've found this one, and so I've been using it. I've read in some places that in the early days after the forming of the federal government, that the officers on the military post were allowed to have second sort of positions or second ways in which to make some money, because their officer's salary in most cases wasn't very much money and wasn't enough to really keep them financially stable. So the government allowed them to do some things on the federal land, like start a business. And some of the businesses that they would commonly start were agriculture, so they would do some farming, and distilling, and they would distill liquors. When they started doing this, there slowly came into effect more and more and more regulations. And somehow these regulations spilled over off the federal lands onto the private sector. And so these people, the instrumentalities and the civilians in Congress, have been pushing people by lies to register their businesses, register their property, register their children, register all these things, which in reality, these things were only supposed to take effect on the federal lands. And we see this in the GSA manual that I showed in a recently posted video just previous to this one. So this is an officer's manual, and it does talk about officers who start businesses. There's not a whole lot of information on it, but I'll show you what it does have. And there is information available in other places. And this book is available online. I believe you can just do a Google search and it'll come up. It's on page 440. So remember now, the officers were limited to working on the post. They had a home on the post. They couldn't leave the post. The posts are the military posts, and because they're military posts, they have to stay manned. If they're not manned, then they're considered abandoned. And if they're abandoned, then we're not protected. They're not doing their job if they're not constantly on post. So it says, officers engaging in business. So because these federal officers, called capital C, citizens of the United States, which is in the Constitution a couple of times, they are required to always be on the military post. And if the commanding officer is not on the military post, and the executive officer has to be on the military post, it's set up much like the seat of government is. If the president as commanding officer is not available, then the executive officer has to be available. The posts always have to be manned because they're military posts. A military post cannot ever be abandoned. So officers who are on these various posts inside the states are also required to keep their posts manned. And that makes it difficult for them to run a business. So what they were allowed to do was have a business on post. They could make furniture, they could do agriculture, they could invent things, they could copyright their writings, they could do all sorts of things on post. And this allowed them to make some extra money. But because this was considered private property that they were, or a private engagement that they were involved in, and they were deriving an advantage by being on the military post, then they had to pay an excise tax when they took that stuff off the military post. And when they brought private property on the military post, they had to pay an impost. That's why it's called an impost. They had to pay taxes on those things that they developed on the public lands, on the federal military post. So along came rights, but also came duties. So they had the right to run a business, but they also had the duty to pay a federal tax. Now, this is what was expanded. This has been expanded into our states, off the federal lands, onto our state lands, and onto our private property, where they're telling us that we have to register our businesses, we have to pay taxes, we have to do all these things. That's why when you go into any of these websites and you register to have an account, you're not asked if you're a citizen of the United States of America or if you live in the United States of America. No, they always ask you, are you a citizen of the United States, or is your country the United States? And this, because it's your only option to choose United States, they charge you a tax. There's only a couple websites that I've seen where they actually let you choose United States of America as your country or your nation. So being that you are stating that you're on the federal lands, being United States, it's then applying all those codes and regulations to you. So the lie comes in and telling you that you're a citizen of the United States, or a United States citizen, which is a civilian, and a civilian working on a military post, or that you are engaging in some sort of commerce on a military post, which you are likely not unless you are. And if you're not subject to all those rules and regulations. And my question then is, wouldn't that then be a, quote, taking, end quote? Isn't that a form of taking? Lying to you to get you to do something, or requiring you to do something that you're not actually required to do. And if you don't do it, they'll come after you. So officers engaging in business, with the exception of AR 60310, which prohibits officers from furnishing supplies or services to the government, there is nothing in law or in the Army regulation on this subject, which is a matter entirely within the regulation of the War Department. It is quite common for officers to make investments and sometimes to engage passively in reputable business that in no way interferes with the proper performance of their duties. So even today, if you join the military and you want a second job, you have to go to your commanding officer and you have to request his permission to have that job or to continue in that job, because the commanding officer has to make sure that whatever job that is, that it's not going to interfere with your official duties, or it's not in some way a conflict of interest with what the military mission is. However, there is considerable doubt of the propriety of an officer's engaging actively in business, even though such act in no way interfered with the proper performance of his military duties. Of course, should an officer engage in a disreputable or fraudulent business, because that's conduct unbecoming of an officer, officers are supposed to be held up to the utmost highest standard, and when they're not, it looks bad on the federal government, or at least it did back then when this manual was written in the early 1900s, when they actually still cared about how the public viewed them. They don't care anymore. He would lay himself liable to trial under the 61st. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I missed a sentence. Or should he use his official position to further an undertaking of any kind? So using his position to gain advantage. So using his official position to further an undertaking, which is what they do nowadays. And Brett Baer wrote about that in his book. I don't have it right on me right now, but he talks about how and I've seen this many times myself. An officer in the military nowadays would serve in a position as, like, let's just say commander, and he would go through certain special military schools offered only to the military people. He would go and get an education at public expense, the GI Bill or what have you. And he would do all this work and take all these courses and classes. And whenever he was about to retire, what he would do is he would take his position, rewrite all the requirements for it, declare that it can only be filled by a person with all those very specific and detailed requirements. And then when he was retired, the job position would go to HRO, and it would be converted from a military position to a civilian position. So then he could apply, after he retired from the military and has his military pay, he could retire and apply for that position as a civilian, and then step into that position, and now he's got his retirement pay as a military person, and now he's making 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 120,000 a year, because he's the only one that qualifies for that position as a civilian. And that's one of the ways I believe they're taking advantage of their position, because they're making it so that they can retire from their position and then get rehired as a civilian in the same position. And they write the qualifications so that no other person on the earth could match for that position, because it's called competitive service. When you work as a civil servant, you're in the competitive service. It means you're competing with other people for that position. So if you're competing with other people for that position, and you're the only one that has all the qualifications for it, then you're the one that's going to get the job. I knew someone who was really close to me, who was a Navy officer, and that's what he was doing. He was getting ready to retire, and I knew him personally. And this was his big plan. He was going to retire and make his position a civil service position, and he was going to turn around and step right back into his position, keep his military retirement pay, and step right into the position as a civil servant and make 150,000 a year, doing exactly what he did before when he was in the military. Okay, so I would say that, yeah, that's sort of taking advantage of your position, and could maybe in some way considered a taking, because he's taking advantage of his position. And the way that he's doing it is deceitful and fraudulent and really unbecoming of an public officer. So he would lay himself liable to trial, but who's going to take him to trial? Nobody. Okay, so on the ground that retired pay is hardly sufficient for an officer to support himself and family, retired officers are permitted to engage actively in business, and a number of them do this. Okay, no problem. You retire and you want to engage in some kind of business. That's no big deal. Everybody does that. A lot of people do that. Maybe not everybody. But to engage in a business where you derived a benefit because of your position in the military, now that's something else. That's using your official position to further your business undertaking. You're gaining an advantage from your position in the military. Okay, so let's see. So business registrations came at a time when the government realized that they needed to really get a hold and a handle on officers engaging in business in such a way that the federal government then needed to oversee some of these undertakings by these federal officers, these military officers, because they were becoming questionable. So the officers on post had to register their businesses. They had to ask permission to work. They had to register. They had to do these things so that someone could oversee them and make sure that they weren't in some sort of conflict of interest, that they weren't deriving an advantage from their position. Many of them do. They do today. And not only this, but what has happened is, like I mentioned, is that it spilled over. So they lie and they say, well, everybody has to register their business. Everybody does not have to register their business because, as I've shown you in the GSA manual, the federal government only has authority on federal lands. And at that, only exclusive at the seat and like on places purchased for forts. So there's a certain type of authority they have on military posts and little authority off those posts. So when they build a federal building that's not particular to being military on some lands off a military post, they really don't have a lot of authority there, if any. So they can't be using federal resources to gain an advantage in their business undertakings. Now, we've seen places like Walmart, who some would say derives an advantage, because we've seen Walmart used for military purposes. So we've seen Walmart used for military purposes. So doesn't that give Walmart an advantage over other businesses in the private sector? So then you have the federal government competing with the private sector. And that's not what they're supposed to do. So they're not supposed to monopolize business. And that's what they're doing when they use their pretended authority to force people in under it, to force people to register their businesses, to get licenses, to pay fees, to follow their rules and regulations. There's no requirement for that off the federal lands, just none. Unless you're a person in the government, working for the government, getting government pay, supposed to be held to the highest level of ethics and morals, and you're trying to do business and compete with the private sector in a way where you're using your position as a federal person to gain advantage. So their income as a federal officer was not their only income, and any other income was supposed to be overseen by the federal government for purposes of conflict of interest between the public and the private sectors, for monopolization purposes. And that is true even still today. Like I said, if you were in the military and you wanted to start a business, you have to go to your commanding officer and you have to let him know what you plan on doing, and he'll tell you yes, no, maybe. It depends on whether or not it's not only going to conflict with your position, but whether it conflicts with the standards that they require the military to be held to. Of course, when you get into the top ranks, generals and admirals and commanders and lieutenants and all these people, apparently they're not held to the highest standard. They can basically do whatever they want. So it says residents of the United States. Residents of the United States are the officers on the federal lands. Like it or not, believe it or not, it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter if you like it. It doesn't matter how you feel about it. Residents of the United States are the people living in military housing on the federal lands. They're allowed $100 worth of articles in the nature of personal effects at their present foreign value, free of duty, provided they are not intended for other purposes or for sale or for to be used in business and properly declared. So what this means to me when I read it, the way I understand how it works in the military, is that if the military issues me some equipment, I cannot then use that equipment in the private sector for my business purposes. So I can't turn around and sell it off post. And this is one of the reasons why their businesses had to be registered. They have to be able to be overseen. And if there ever is a question about it, they need to see who's doing what. So they're the ones that are supposed to follow all the federal laws on the licenses, the requirement for registration of businesses. They're required to follow the distribution laws, the labeling laws, the safety laws, the labor laws. They're the ones required to do that. And they had to register their business also because they had to pay taxes, because they were already receiving federal money. And a lot of their work they did on post, and so they're deriving a benefit from being on post, and so they have to pay federal taxes on that private stuff. And I'd also like to mention here that the libertarians, I have emailed, I went through as many libertarian websites as I could find, and I found a bunch of emails to some of the candidates running and some of the people in the Libertarian Party position. And I sent them out an email with a video. I think I attached a video with it. And I said, are you aware of some of these things? And I must have emailed at least 100 of them. I got one email back. One person responded and said, how did you get my email? And I said, I got it off the Libertarian website. And I was surprised that this is what he wanted to talk to me about. He wanted to talk to me about how I got his email, a candidate for the Libertarian Party. And then he says, well, my email was supposed to be removed, so I need to know where you got my email, what website. And I thought, I don't have time to look up this information for you. If you don't know where your email is listed on what website, that's not my problem. But I was kind of shocked that this was the only response I got. I've emailed a whole bunch of people that were listed as with their emails on the Cato website and asked them the same questions. And I've got very little responses, and all the responses were, what are you talking about? I've never heard that before. And shockingly enough, it was the same with the Mises website. I emailed as many people as I could find from the Mises website, and I said, are you aware of this? Are you aware that the Constitution is basically just setting up a military for military forts? No, I've never heard that before. From one of their top people who are out on the internet, on YouTube, talking all the time, didn't have a clue. And it's right here. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. But it's even in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, where it says we have authority on the lands we purchase and at the seat of government. Nowhere else. Basically, that the states are not going to interfere with military stuff. And they don't, nobody knows, or they're pretending not to know. Other people are saying that people should get angry and take to the streets and fight, fight, fight. And I say, why? It's not going to do any good. The only thing you can do is peacefully protest. They don't care. You can walk the streets until your feet fall off. They don't care. It doesn't change anything. As a matter of fact, it lets it keep continuing because people don't really know why they're even marching. They don't really know that freedom awaits them. It only requires them to know some things. There's no reason to go take to the streets and get shot at, to get routed, to pay for permits, to march, to pay for permits, to have, these events with these bands and this food and, all these speakers coming in and flying in from all over the place to tell you more lies, to tell you in your face that they still don't understand the Constitution, what it is, what it means, where your place is among all this. It keeps preaching to you. They keep preaching to you as if you have to fight for freedom, even though you're not really exactly sure what that is, or where it comes from, or why you have it, or what limits the federal government actually has. So you're taken to the streets and you really don't know why. Freedom, freedom, freedom. That's great. That's awesome. What is that? Nobody knows. But we're learning it. I've written at least 10 FOIAs to the GSA office asking them for the original copies or copies of the original inventory reports filled out by the people in the states, and they refuse. We don't have them, or ask those people over there, ask those people over there, ask that person over there. They're in the libraries. Go get to the library. Well, the libraries have lists, but they don't have the original copies of the actual forms where the inventories were taken. So you see people on YouTube all the time talking, and they're not talking about this. They're not telling you really that the federal government has no power, and they're not showing you why and where they do have power at, and who's supposed to do what, and who is what, and that you're not part of it. But hopefully from my videos, I've been able to help people understand a little bit of that. Hopefully I've helped them understand that they don't need to waste their time taking to the streets, causing problems, getting shot at, having the military come in and shoot at you, or governors getting scared and worried that you're going to hurt them and take over their capitals and their houses on the state capital lands, and calling the police in to reroute you and make you pay for permits and all this kind of stuff. It's all ridiculous. The streets are ours anyway. The capitals are ours. The military lands are ours. The states are ours. Everything is ours. Nothing belongs to them. Even their authority and their power they had to get from us. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can understand that we are free, sovereign, and independent. And the fight is already over.